Before you start your own podcast, listen to this episode first so you know what you are jumping into. Are you ready to get started? I know I am. Episode 232 starts right now. Welcome to the Lora Shipman Show minicast, a special edition of my podcast where it's just you, me, my mic, your earphones, plus quick tips and hacks you can implement immediately to improve your life and your business. Are you ready to get started? I know I am. Let's dive in. Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome back to the show. I am so glad you're here with me today because it is my favorite day of the week, and that's a minicast day. And if you have not been here for a minicast, where have you been, friend? This is the day that I give you a shot in the arm of information and value. And then at the end of it, you have a little job to do. You've got some homework, right? You've got to take what you learned here today and execute it in your business. And today we are talking about 11 things I wish I knew before starting a podcast. So I started my podcast, I believe it's been like 2.5 years ago. And podcasting was just getting popular. Like people were starting to emerge outside of the big guys were starting to emerge with their own podcasts. And I was one of them. So I didn't really have a lot of mentors who could guide me through what I needed to know when I started my podcast. So in true Lora style, basically what I do is I usually, A, don't tell anybody what I'm about to do. B, I don't do a lot of research because that will maybe make me stop in my tracks. And C, I just kind of rip off the Band-Aid and get started. And that's kind of exactly what I did with podcasting. And if you go back to episode 1, please don't do it. Just don't do it. It was pretty horrific. I'll tell you a little story. If you haven't heard this one before, I live in Tampa Bay, Florida, and I think I started my podcast in the spring, and it was starting to heat up here in Florida. I had my equipment, and I'm listening to everything back to me, like checking out how the audio sounds. And I sounded like I was talking into a tin can. And I'm thinking it's because we have all these hard surfaces in the state of Florida. Like our houses are tiled, and there's not a lot of sound absorption in our homes. A lot of our homes are open concept, mine included. And so I thought, man, my voice is just bouncing off walls in my hard floors. And so to combat that, I thought the best thing I could do would be to go somewhere like in a closet or something and drape my head with a towel just to muffle the echo. It was so stinking hot. It was horrible. I did this for a while until I realized I didn't have my mic set up correctly. Well, isn't that fun? So I thought, you know what? I know people are thinking about starting a podcast, and I think it's a really good idea to do so because it is a fabulous marketing tool and a fabulous networking tool. I have met so many incredible people through the show that I would have never met before if I didn't have a podcast. So there's some definite benefits to having a podcast. I'm not going to go through all of those today because that's actually a show in itself. But today I want you to think about some things that you can put in place before you start your show, some things that will help you not make the same mistakes that I've made. And I've made mistakes when it has come to my podcast, and I'll be the first one to raise their hand and admit to it. So if I can help you avoid those mistakes, that would be phenomenal. Okay, these are not in any order. I'm just going to talk to you about the different things I've learned along the way that I wish I had known. I wish somebody was there to tell me. And the first thing is this equipment. I wish somebody had told me exactly what equipment to get and not to get. I did waste some money. The one thing that I love about my equipment is I love my microphone, and it's a Blue Yeti or a Yeti Blue. I don't even know how to say it. But once you learn how to set it up, it is phenomenal. I love it. I get a lot of compliments on the sound quality, and it's been a good investment for me. Another thing that I purchased that I did not need was a sound shield. And it's one of these things that it's like a half circle that goes around you and the microphone, and you can't see your laptop or your recording software, any of that stuff. So I would not recommend a sound shield. I don't think you need it, but I will recommend a pop filter. That is one thing. They're very inexpensive. It's just something that softens the B sounds and the P sounds. So it just makes the audio a little bit better. And then the last thing I use for equipment is something that was already installed on my Mac, and that was GarageBand. Now, I know a lot of other people use different things like Audacity, and maybe Podbean, I think, also has some sort of software you can use. If you have a Mac, chances are you already have GarageBand, and it works great. I like it. So that's my first tip, is know the equipment that you really need, and it's very minimal. The one thing I didn't mention that's not really equipment, it's more software, is a podcast host. And again, that is another episode for another day, but I use Libsyn, Libsyn, as my podcast host. And I really like that because Libsyn will send my podcast show out to a bunch of other platforms. But like I said, that's a show for another day. So that's my first piece of advice on equipment. The second piece of advice would be, or things that I wish I knew, was don't pay attention to the time. What you really want to pay attention to, and when I'm talking about time, the length of the show is what I mean. You really want to pay attention to, is your show consumable? Does it move along fast enough so that people will stay interested and listen? So by that I mean, is it good for a commute? Is it good for a workout or a house cleaning? Like, will people be able to listen to your podcast doing those things? If you make it too long, chances are people will not go through and listen to the entire episode. And I have a feeling when analytics get better for podcasting, there is going to be a huge amount of emphasis on listen through, meaning does the audience listen from point zero all the way to the end of the episode, or do they drop off somewhere in between? To avoid this, you just want to make sure your content is highly consumable, and that means taking into consideration how long your podcast goes. The next one has to do with the content itself. And what you want to do is make sure you outline but don't script. This is something that I think I had done really well because I always could tell when someone was reading a script instead of talking to their audience. And this brings me to my next couple of points. When you are talking into a microphone, speak with a smile on your face because you can hear that lightness in your voice when you are smiling. And then the other thing is, be yourself. Talk to your audience like you're talking to a best friend. If you guys could see me right now, my hands are waving all over the place because I talk with my hands naturally, and I feel as though that carries through in my broadcast episode to the audience, is when I'm talking with my hands and being my natural self. You know when it's not me because it doesn't sound like Lora and all her Lora-isms when she's stumbling over her words and maybe losing pace or something like that. That doesn't sound authentic when you're reading from a script. It sounds authentic when you are being real and being that person. So make sure you use outlines and bullet points and talk to the topic and not the script. Okay, so just as a recap for those three things, you want to outline, don't script, be yourself, talk like you're talking to a best friend, and speak with a smile on your face. Okay. The next thing that I really wish I had paid more attention to when I first started out podcasting was proper guest vetting. And here's what I mean. People will come onto your podcast show with their own agenda. You need to make sure that their content and the way they deliver it is in line with your brand and your show and the purpose of your show. I've had many people want to come on my show and do some sort of a infomercial for their product, hoping to sell people. And I have to tell people very specifically that my podcast is a teaching podcast. People tune in because they want to learn something that they can execute in their daily lives. And I don't want to waste anybody's time. And I'm very clear with my guests up front about this because I've had some instances where people just pop on thinking they can sell stuff to my audience and that they're a captive audience, and I'm not going to allow that to happen. So I'm going to get off my little soapbox there, but my advice to you is be really clear on what kind of a podcast that you want, and then make sure that you have some sort of a vetting process that allows you to make sure the people you are bringing on your show aren't going to waste your audience's time, they're not going to waste your time, and they're going to deliver the value that you require to meet the expectations of your show. And that brings me to my next point. Avoid the wingers. What do I mean by wingers. These are the people who don't want to take the time to go through a vetting process and to fill out an outline and all those things that you require for your show. They just want to show up and wing it. We'll just have a conversation and wing it. Those people give me the biggest red flags ever because they think that they can just get on the show and just discuss things, but they're not seeing it from the audience's perspective. They're not seeing that the audience wants to have some sort of a direction. Otherwise, the conversation gets boring. If the conversation isn't leading somewhere, you're going to lose your audience. And I hate to say this, but a lot of times when you have guests on the show, they think they're super interesting and they may not really be that interesting. So really always have your audience in mind and always ask yourself, how is this going to help my audience and why would they care? Why would they spend the time to listen to this show with this person on it? And you have to ask those questions because your brand is at stake. Your show's brand is at stake if you don't ask those difficult questions. Which brings me to my next point. You don't have to have guests on your show if you don't want to. If you just want it to be your show and you've got all the content and the value that you want to drop on your audience, go for it. As a matter of fact, I've gotten kind of choosy about who I have on my show and who I don't have on my show. And a lot of times it's just me. And every once in a while, when I go through the vetting process of my guests and I find some good people, I'll pop them on there. But don't feel as though you have to have guests because you know what? It's another layer of responsibility and unpredictability. You don't know once you get into the interview what these people are going to actually say or do, or are they going to stick to the outline that you agreed upon, all of those things. So think twice about having guests on your show because it is a lot of extra work and it may not be necessary, especially if you can provide the same value or if not better value to your audience if the show is only you. The next thing I wish I knew, or maybe even thought a little bit more deeper about, was the time and consistency required when doing a podcast show. I knew it would take some work, but I didn't realize how much work it would be. So some of the things you need to consider with the work aspect of it is it's coming up with content. What are you going to talk about on a regular basis? How often are you going to podcast? I podcast twice a week. Some people podcast once a month, some people once a week. The amount of content you put out there will determine how quickly your podcast grows. So you need to figure that out. Then you need to figure out, well, how in depth are your show notes going to be? And what do you need to involve with all of that? And then it comes to the guests, like how involved do you want to make that whole process? So there are a lot of layers to podcasting. So it has to be a passion of yours. If you like it, great. I love it. I love dropping the content, the value. I love the way it makes me feel when I know I'm helping people because I get the feedback from the audience. But if it's not a passion of yours, don't force yourself into doing it because it is a commitment and you do need to stay consistent with your podcasting. It's just like social media. The more consistent you are, the more you show up for your audience, the more they are going to show up for you. One other thing that I did not really think through all the way, I knew in the back of my mind I'd have to do it, but I didn't think, well, at what level will I have to do it, is marketing the podcast. That's also a bunch of time and effort. So again, really think this through. There is a lot of work. Okay, the next thing that I recommend doing, and I've always done this from the beginning, so this is something that I didn't really know to do, but it just kind of happened as the podcast was developing and unfolding. But that was keeping some sort of a database of podcast ideas, a running list of topics, and organizing those so you know you're not repeating yourself. Because sometimes we can forget. If you're like me, I put out a ton of content between all my social media platforms, my blog, and my podcast. That's a lot of content. And I forget what I've put out there. So you have to have some sort of tracking system in place so you don't forget what episodes you've released, what they're about, so that you always have something new and fresh to offer your audience. All right, the last thing I would say you should really consider if you are going to put together a podcast show is batching your content. It is a lifesaver. So today, I think I've recorded either 4 or 5 shows in a matter of a couple of hours. And it just makes everything go so much more smoothly when I have a bunch of shows, and I'm using air quotes, in the can, because that way I can schedule them out just like I can a social media post, and they're going to hit all my platforms on the exact day and time I want them to go live. So batching is a lifesaver, and I would also recommend this with guests. So if you have ever been a guest on my show, or if you wonder how I do it, I reserve Fridays for podcast recordings, whether it's just me or me and guests. I use Fridays as my day to record shows, and then I get them up in the scheduler so that I don't have to be concerned about when I've got the next show going live. Okay, my friends, well, that's it. Those are the things that I either wish I had known before getting into podcasting, or that I had thought through a little further, because it does make a huge difference in the way that you format your show. Okay, so that's it for this episode. Your homework is to go through all of those tips and really think about how you would structure your show, what you're willing to do, how often you want to do it. Get all those things that I talked about out on paper so you're fully prepared to put on a wonderful, amazing show. And I know you can do it. I know you can. So here's your homework. If you do decide to put together a show, I want to know about it. Go ahead and drop your show name in the comment section so the audience can see it. And then also go ahead and market your show on Instagram stories. Take a snapshot of your cover art or whatever it is you're going to put out there and tag me in it so I can go check out your show. I want to know what you're talking about. All right. Until next time, my friends, you know what to do. Stay safe, stay healthy, but most of all, stay social. Hey, before you go, I have a question for you. Are you loving the show? Let me know about it. Take a screenshot of the episode you are listening to and drop it in your social media posts or stories. Or better yet, give this show a review on iTunes or your favorite podcast app, letting me know that you listened in. If you have a topic or show idea, please don't be shy. I want to hear from you. Send me an email or a DM. I would love to hear your suggestions. All the links are in the show notes. Anyways, I just wanted to say thank you, as always, for tuning into the show today and every day you listen in.